Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Part 2. Chapter 5, Part 2. Subsection 4. She began very nearly as she had begun to the priest. "I'm in what they call a state of mind," she said. "May I tell you all about it?" He inclined his head. Then she told him frankly and fully, first that she was in a mood of apprehensiveness about Neville, and that she had no kind of reason for it. "Here's his letter," she said, "that's just come. Read it, please." He took it, drew out his glasses, wiped them on his handkerchief, and began to read. He looked exactly like a businessman studying a document. As he finished, she broke in again. "You see, it's quite satisfactory as far as it goes. He tells me about meeting Madame Selva and what she said, and about the crush at the Cecil, and how he went a walk in the park and met a small boy, rather like Jim, and tried to help him mend his ship, and how the ship wouldn't be mended, and then about his going to the cathedral on Sunday, and how, although the choir sang wonderfully, he couldn't bear the music, and then about Enid too. It's all natural enough, and quite in his own way, though it doesn't seem to me quite as cheerful as his last, but that's not the point." "No?" he said questioningly. "No, I was unhappy long before the letter came. I've been like it ever since Saturday. And then there are the omens." She stopped, wondering whether even to Mr. Morpeth she could speak of her foolishness. But to her surprise, he showed none himself. He nodded gently when he had taken off his glasses, and began to wipe them again. "I suppose you notice how things happen," he said, "like birds flying, or a shadow over the sun, and think they're signs?" "How do you know?" she asked, amazed. "Because I used to do it myself," he said, "until I learned how useless it was." "You think it all nonsense, then, just as I do, at least just as I know it is really?" "Not all nonsense," he said imperturbably. "I am entirely convinced, from simple observation, that there is some connection between different things that seem to have no connection. That there are laws that are true and active in all realms at once, and that sensitive or intuitive people can sometimes perceive them. Oh no, Mrs. Fanning, I don't think it's all nonsense at all." "But why did you call it useless?" "Well," he said, leaning back a little, "because if the thing is to happen, it will happen. And besides that, I do not think it quite Christian in spirit. We should have more confidence in God. 'Take no thought,' said our Saviour. I forget the Catholic version, but it means that we should not fret and be anxious about the future. I should leave that kind of thing alone, Mrs. Fanning." She was silent a moment. "May I tell you 2 more things?" she asked. "Why, certainly." She told him then about the west bedroom and Jim's curiosity as to the grave. He listened without moving. "I put more trust in your own feelings," he said. "It is your intuition that interprets such events anyhow. You would have thought nothing of them if you had not already been anxious." She confessed that this was true. "I dare say your intuition is quite right," he continued gently. "Many people have that gift, some more, some less. It is like, you won't be offended, but it is like a peacock who knows, even before the barometer, that rain is coming." She smiled with an effort, but felt a little sick. "You mean you think I am probably right in foreseeing misfortune?" "Well, do not let us call it misfortune. We cannot possibly tell. Let us say that it is pain to one you love that is coming. I think myself it is coming, he added meditatively. This time she had to make an effort even to speak. You think so? To Neville? Why? He continued gently polishing his glasses, which he had held still for the last 2 or 3 minutes. Then he began to speak. She did not interrupt him till he had finished. His voice was quite quiet, as if he mused aloud. Well, he said, if you will watch people carefully, you will practically always find that the type to which your nephew belongs, of which in every way he is so excellent an example, the type of happy optimist who disregards suffering instead of really facing it, always has to suffer, and considerably more than other people. God Almighty, if I may say so, has made them almost violently happy, out of all proportion, so to say. Well, they cannot be left like that, or they would be one-sided. Well, they are prepared for suffering in a very marked manner. They are naturally buoyant. They can ignore and therefore avoid pain, or they can bear it, in moderation, in virtue of their pride. Now, that will not do at all if they are to be conformed to the image of Christ. Therefore, they must suffer, and suffer rightly. He paused a moment, then continued. I have observed Sir Neville, and, I need not say, I have learned to love him, and I see in him every sign that he will have to suffer, sharply. If he did not, I should be afraid for him. Now, I know really nothing of the young lady to whom he is engaged. I have seen her twice only, once in the churchyard, and once I had the privilege of speaking to her when she was out with Sir Neville in the park. Aunt Anna looked at him sharply, but she did not speak. Well, I think it very likely that part of his pain must come through her. I may be very wrong about that, but I must confess that I formed an opinion of her. I have a terrible habit of doing so. I often try to correct it. And I think that she will be one occasion of suffering to him, whether now or later, I do not know. But that is not all. He paused again. This was the very point to Aunt Anna. She, too, had tried to think that all her apprehensiveness came from her knowledge of Enid. It might even be her jealousy of Enid. But this last day or two had taught her that this, at any rate, was not all. There was something even larger approaching. A cloud greater than any man's hand was coming up, and its shadow had fallen on the corniced door above the gallery. But still she said nothing. That is not all. You will think me fanciful, perhaps, but there is a shadow on this house, Mrs. Fanning. It fell on my own house first. I knew that it was there too. It fell on my dear daughter. A week before God took her to himself. When Sir Neville looked in at my window. When he was so good as to come across and bring me the news, I knew what he had come to say. But it was on his face too. Now, some men might call this a curse. Well, we may call it that if we will, so long as we remember that a curse is but the shadow of a blessing, that he himself was made a curse for us, who is our blessing. That is all that the shadow is, Mrs. Fanning. It is the shadow of our Father's hand. There was dead silence as he ended, and fell again to polishing his glasses. The noon lay hot and still on park and stream and house. Far away, again, the wood-pigeon began his broken cooing. It was not till he ended that Aunt Anna drew a long, shivering breath. Not that, she whispered. Not on Neville. He looked at her compassionately. Listen again, he said. I think we spoke here once of the sins of the fathers being visited on the children. That is not a curse, Mrs. Fanning, as the word is ordinarily used. It is not a vindictive law, it is a law of mercy, that the love which should unite parents to children may do what love alone can do, and that is to turn suffering into joy and pain into atonement. It is when the punishment is not borne here, as if God himself despaired, it is then that the horror comes. Now, I know nothing of Sir Neville's father, except what you have told me. I do not listen to gossip. She broke in. He was horrible. He was unlovable, let us say. Well, cannot he now be rendered lovable? I know no way except by pain. Would it not be a noble thing if his son could suffer for him, and be himself transformed into a Christopher? You and I know what purgatory is. Well, I can't bear it, she cried. And you too have your part. You are bearing it now, and you will bear it better still if you will choose to understand. That is exactly what love means. You suffer because you love. If you did not love, you would not suffer. Then go on and suffer and love. She broke suddenly into weeping. Subsection 5. She sat there again that evening after dinner, when Jim had gone to bed and the stars were out. The breathless day had passed to breathless night. She sat here, at the open window, without even a shawl over her shoulders. There was not a breath to stir the thin silk curtains that hung over the wide-flung lattices. The house was dark, except for the oblong of light that was the door above the curved steps. She felt weary in soul and body, but all resentment and resistance were gone. There was no joy yet, only passivity and expectancy. She was as one who has fought against a mortal sickness and passed beyond fighting, and yet death will not come. Every word she had heard from her old friend had met with the response of her understanding, although with the savage protest of her heart. She knew that it would be as he said. It was not Enid now that troubled her. There was not even a spark of jealousy left. Enid? Why, yes, no doubt she would be the forerunner of pain, the leader of the grim little procession that must trample over the heart of the lad she loved so much. But there was more than all that. Enid was not great enough to cast such a shadow as that which lay over all that she cared for. But even her heart now had ceased to protest. It lay there, within her, inert and quiet. In pain, of course, but in pain that could no longer crush, since that on which it lay was already broken. She had been right then from the beginning. Her misery in this dear pavilion, when his first letter had come from Rome, had been true enough in its instinct. Her deepening misery since Saturday had been its corroboration. Yet why had it come so swiftly? Was it that the shadow, too, was darkening as swiftly? Then, when would the blackness fall? Then suddenly she remembered, in an abrupt break of thought, that Neville had said nothing as to having seen any doctor, and her heart leapt again in a broken kind of hope that there was nothing but some physical illness that impended, and that this might yet be stayed off by prudence. She would write to Neville tomorrow, and tell him that he must go at once if he loved her. And then again her heart sank down. A shadow such as this was not just a matter that could be banished by a doctor's consulting room and a few drugs. She would not banish it so, even if she could. She would not banish it so, even if she could. Yes, she had thought that. And as she reflected on her thought, she perceived that even already she had begun, scarcely knowing it herself, to realize what had been said to her. To understand that pain was not the greatest of evils, that it might be even not an evil at all, but a good, that a curse, if truly the shadow of a blessing, might be that very blessing that could come no otherwise than in a sombre dress. The lawn was soaked in dew as she walked across it on her way back to the house half an hour later. She did not know it till the chill struck straight through her thin silk stockings. "Why, it's wet," she murmured, and went on. There had begun to rise in her, still incalculably fragile, still to be quenched out again by the faintest breath of personal desire, a thin, flickering flame that warmed ever so slightly the cold misery of her heart. She had begun to see that there was a capability of joy in pain. No more than that. That if to love was to suffer, then also that to suffer rightly was to love. And love, after all, was the only joy. Jim was awake when she came softly into his room with a shaded light. He turned his big eyes upon her, unwinkingly. "Mummy?" he said. "Yes, my darling. Why aren't you asleep?" Jim passed over such an irrelevant question with the disdain of indifference. "Mummy, did you mind what I asked you yesterday?" For a moment she forgot. "Why, what about?" About Uncle Neville's grave." She paused. Then she spoke deliberately. "No, my dear. At least I did, but I don't now." As she came out into the gallery again, she turned to the right instead of the left, and then stood considering. The house was quite quiet now. The servants were far away, and her maid not yet come up. Yet she had no fear. She was trying to remember whether she had taken out the key of the door between the bathroom and the west room, and locked it after her. Then she remembered that she had not. She went straight through into Neville's room, still carrying the shaded light she used for visiting Jim in bed, through the bathroom and into the place she had once dreaded so much. The bed stood, still like a catafalque, with its curtains drawn once more, but she was not afraid. She stood there as if listening. Then she spoke, as if she asked a question and did not fear the answer. "Yes?" she said.